Picture the Nile Valley in ancient times, a vast, sun-baked landscape, shimmering under an unforgiving sun. Every year, almost like clockwork, the sky would darken and the river would begin to swell. But this was no ordinary flood. This was a torrent of monumental power, a deluge that transformed the entire world as the Egyptians knew it. The waters didn't just rise, they roared across the land, swallowing fields, villages, and pathways in a churning, muddy surge. For any other civilization, such an annual catastrophe would have been a death sentence, a relentless cycle of destruction and despair. Yet here, along these fertile banks, something truly miraculous happened. The ancient Egyptians did not merely endure this overwhelming force, they harnessed it. They turned what should have been their greatest threat into the very source of their power, their prosperity, and their enduring legacy. So how did they achieve the impossible? How did the ancient Egyptians not just survive, but actually thrive in the face of an annual deluge that could have wiped them out entirely? The answer lies in a remarkable blend of observation, innovation, and foresight, a masterful set of Egyptian flood survival strategies that reveal a civilization thinking centuries ahead of its time. This story is not just about holding back water, it is about human ingenuity at its most profound. It's about reading the subtle signs of the natural world and responding with systems so elegant they feel almost timeless. The Egyptians didn't fight the Nile, they learned to dance with it, to predict its moods, and to channel its life-giving force in ways that built one of the most stable and long-lasting societies in human history. We are about to journey back thousands of years to uncover the secrets behind their success. We will explore the brilliant minds that looked upon a raging river and saw not chaos, but opportunity. We will see how they turned seasonal danger into agricultural abundance, and how their deep understanding of the environment laid the groundwork for architectural and cultural achievements that still leave us in awe today. This is a testament to resilience, to the power of foresight, and to a relationship with nature that was both respectful and brilliantly manipulative. So prepare to be amazed by the sophistication of ancient planning, and to discover how a civilization's response to a recurring natural disaster became the very foundation of its golden age. To truly grasp the brilliance of their response, we must first understand the immense challenge they faced. Every civilization has its heartbeat, and for ancient Egypt, that rhythm was the Nile. But this was not a gentle, predictable pulse. It was a seasonal explosion known as the inundation or akhet. For roughly 3 months each year, the world as the Egyptians knew it would vanish, replaced by a vast inland sea. This was the great paradox of their existence. The same force that promised life also carried the specter of utter annihilation. The floodwaters surged north from the highlands of Ethiopia, swollen by torrential summer rains, carrying within them a precious cargo, a thick, nutrient-rich black silt. When the waters eventually receded, they left behind a fresh layer of this incredibly fertile mud, transforming the desert's edge into the most productive farmland in the ancient world. This annual gift of silt and water was what allowed a vast civilization to flourish in the midst of a desert. Without the akhet, there would have been no granaries bursting with grain, no surplus to feed the artisans, soldiers, and pharaohs who built the pyramids. The Nile's inundation was, quite literally, the source of all life, yet this life-giving event was terrifyingly powerful and fundamentally unpredictable. The Egyptians lived at the mercy of a river they could not control. A bad Nile was a constant dread, and it could manifest in 2 devastating forms. If the floodwaters were too low, a phenomenon they called a low Nile, the waters would fail to reach the fields. The life-giving silt would be deposited in the river channel itself. The land would remain parched, and crops would wither and die before they even had a chance to grow. The result was inevitable: widespread famine, social unrest, and a crisis of faith in a pharaoh who is supposed to maintain cosmic order. On the other hand, a high Nile, with waters raging far beyond the normal boundaries, was a cataclysm of a different sort. It was a raw, destructive force that could not be reasoned with. Rampaging floodwaters would sweep away entire villages, drown livestock, and obliterate the intricate network of irrigation channels and field boundaries that had taken generations to build. A flood that was too high didn't just fail to nourish, it actively destroyed the very infrastructure that made agriculture possible, wiping out the stored food supplies and seeds needed for the next planting season. The line between a bountiful harvest and total disaster was terrifyingly thin, hinging on a few cubits of water height. This precarious existence, balanced between abundance and ruin, is what made their survival strategies so vital. They weren't just optimizing for a good year, they were engineering a buffer against catastrophe, building a resilience that would allow their society to endure for millennia. Their entire worldview, their religion, their government, all were shaped by this urgent need to understand, predict, and ultimately tame the immense power of the river that was both their creator and their potential destroyer. Faced with this precarious balance between too much water and too little, the ancient Egyptians knew that survival demanded more than just hope. It required a practical, hands-on solution to move water exactly where it was needed, when it was needed. Out of this necessity, one of the most enduring and elegant agricultural tools in human history was born: the shaduf. At first glance, its design seems almost childlike in its simplicity: a long pole balanced on an upright crossbeam, with a bucket on one end and a heavy counterweight of mud or stones on the other. Yet, this unassuming lever mechanism became a cornerstone of Egyptian civilization, a device so effective that its basic principle is still used in some parts of the world today. Tomb paintings and reliefs from the New Kingdom show us farmers operating the shaduf with a rhythmic, practiced grace. They would pull down the rope to lower the bucket into the river or a canal, allow the counterweight to lift the now full bucket, and then swing the pole around to pour the precious water into an irrigation ditch leading to the fields. It was a perfect marriage of physics and function. The true genius of the shaduf, however, lay not just in its mechanics, but in the profound freedom it gave to Egyptian farmers. The annual inundation naturally watered the fields closest to the river, but vast areas of fertile land lay just beyond its reach, on slightly higher ground. Before the shaduf, these areas were largely unusable for the intensive agriculture needed to support a growing population. The shaduf fundamentally changed that equation. It acted as a mechanical extension of the river itself, enabling farmers to lift water from the main channels and pour it into a network of smaller basins and canals, systematically pushing the green frontier of cultivation further and further into the desert margins. This was a monumental leap in their battle for food security. It meant that even after the floodwaters of the Akhit season receded, farmers could continue to water their crops throughout the dry, scorching months. They were no longer wholly dependent on the whims of a single, seasonal event. They could plant and harvest multiple crops in a year, dramatically increasing their agricultural yield and creating a reliable food surplus that could be stored in state granaries. This surplus was the absolute bedrock of Egyptian stability. It fed the massive labor force that built the pyramids and temples, it supplied the armies that defended the kingdom's borders, and it provided a crucial buffer against the dreaded years of a low Nile when the natural flood was insufficient. By mastering the simple act of lifting water, the Egyptians transformed their relationship with the land, turning previously barren plots into engines of prosperity and ensuring their society could not only survive but expand generation after generation. Of course, while the shaduf was a marvel of personal ingenuity, managing the water supply for individual fields, it represented just one piece of a much larger, more ambitious puzzle. To truly harness the Nile on a scale that could support an entire civilization, the Egyptians had to think bigger, much bigger. They had to become landscape architects on a grand scale, reshaping the very land itself. This is where we move from handheld tools to colossal public works, to a coordinated, society-wide effort that gave rise to vast networks of canals and formidable earthen dikes. Imagine the shaduf as a single, precise brushstroke. The canals and dikes were the sprawling canvas upon which the entire masterpiece of Egyptian agriculture was painted. These were not small community projects. They were state-sponsored endeavors organized and funded by the pharaoh's administration, requiring the labor of thousands and a deep, collective understanding of hydrology and geography. The primary goal was twofold. First, to spread the life-giving floodwaters as far and wide as possible, and second, to protect the heart of their society from the river's destructive potential. To achieve this, they embarked on a monumental task of excavation and construction. They dug extensive networks of canals, functioning like artificial arteries branching off from the main river channel. These canals were designed to deliberately divert the floodwaters, channeling that precious, silt-laden water deep into the desert fringes, creating new, fertile basins where only sand had existed before. It was a way of maximizing the gift of the inundation, ensuring that not a single drop of the Nile's potential was wasted. Think of it like the modern irrigation systems we see in large agricultural regions today, where a central reservoir feeds a complex web of canals and ditches to water entire counties. The Egyptian system was the ancient, brilliant predecessor to this very concept. They were not just waiting for the water to come to them, they were actively going out to claim it, guiding its flow with human intelligence to transform the entire geography of the Nile Valley into a managed, productive ecosystem. But guiding the water was only half the battle. You also had to control its immense power, and this is where the dikes came in. These were not the solid, permanent walls of stone we might associate with modern dams. They were massive embankments made of packed earth, mud, and reeds, built up along the river's banks. Their purpose was simple yet critically important: to act as a physical barrier, holding back the floodwaters and preventing them from washing away everything in their path. These dikes created protected zones, safeguarding villages, granaries, and the most valuable, established farmland from the most violent surges of the inundation. In a way, these ancient earthen structures served the same fundamental purpose as the massive levees that protect cities like New Orleans today. They were a defensive line against a powerful and unpredictable body of water. The management of this system was a delicate, year-round process. Officials, often scribes and surveyors, would carefully monitor the water levels. When the flood was at its peak, they would oversee the strategic breaching of certain dikes at predetermined points to allow water to flow into the canal network and the waiting basins. Then, as the flood began to recede, they would direct the repair of these breaches, trapping the water and the rich silt within the basins, allowing it to saturate the soil thoroughly before the planting season began. This was a cycle of controlled flooding and precise retention, a dance with the river that required impeccable timing and coordination. The success of this entire system, the canals, the dikes, the careful management, turned the entire floodplain into a giant, natural sponge. It captured and held the Nile's annual gift, creating a resilient buffer against drought and ensuring that the land remained productive long after the river itself had returned to its normal channel. This was the ultimate expression of their strategy. They weren't trying to stop the flood, they were trying to slow it down, spread it out, and convince it to settle in, creating a managed abundance that could weather the uncertainties of the natural world. Yet, coordinating the flow of water with canals and dikes while a massive undertaking, was only part of the grand strategy. The real masterpiece of Egyptian water management, the true cornerstone of their entire agricultural system, was a concept so organized and systematic it transformed the entire Nile Valley into a giant, living engine of food production, the Basin Irrigation system. Imagine looking down from above upon the landscape of ancient Egypt after the annual flood. Instead of a single, continuous body of water, you would see a vast, intricate patchwork of enormous, shallow pools, each one separated from the next by tall, robust earthen walls. These were the basins. Each one could cover thousands of acres, and together they formed a national grid of managed fertility. The creation of this system was a testament to centralized planning and social organization on an almost unimaginable scale. The state, acting through the pharaoh's bureaucracy, would dispatch armies of laborers and skilled surveyors, known as rope stretchers, for their use of knotted cords to measure land, to reshape the terrain. They would construct these networks of dikes, or levees, that acted like the walls of a colossal honeycomb, dividing the floodplain into a series of contained, manageable units. This was not haphazard construction. It was a deliberate, calculated redesign of the environment, turning a naturally chaotic flood event into a meticulously controlled, step-by-step agricultural process. The annual cycle of this system was a carefully choreographed performance, a national effort that unfolded with the precision of a seasonal clock. As the Nile began its mighty swell, the entire country moved into a state of readiness. Officials would monitor the rising waters with intense focus. At the perfect moment, when the river was full of the precious, dark silt carried from the highlands of Ethiopia, they would give the command. Laborers would then strategically breach the primary dikes at specific, predetermined inlet points. They weren't just letting the water in, they were guiding it. The silt-laden floodwaters would pour into the first series of basins, rushing through the man-made gaps. Once a basin was filled to the desired depth, the inlet would be sealed shut with mud, stone, and reeds, effectively trapping the water and its life-giving sediment inside. This was the critical first phase, capture. The basin now became a temporary, shallow lake, a giant settling pond where the suspended silt particles could slowly drift to the bottom, blanketing the entire basin floor in a fresh, thick layer of the most fertile soil imaginable. But the process didn't stop there. The trapped water wasn't drained immediately. It was allowed to stand, soaking into the thirsty earth for over a month, sometimes even longer. This prolonged saturation was a stroke of genius. It ensured that the soil absorbed every possible drop of moisture, creating a deep, residual water reserve that would sustain crops long after the surface had dried. Think of it like preparing a sponge. If you just pour water on top, it runs off, but if you let the sponge sit in water, it becomes fully saturated, holding that moisture within its very structure. The Egyptians were doing this on a landscape-wide scale, turning their entire country into a giant, water-retaining sponge. This passive irrigation meant that for the key crops like wheat and barley, no additional watering was needed for the entire growing season. The land itself had been charged with the river's life force. Finally, when the time was right, officials would order the opening of drainage channels at the opposite end of the basin, often leading to a lower-lying basin or back into a main canal. The remaining water would slowly drain away, leaving behind a vast field of deep, moist, and incredibly rich mud, perfectly prepared for sowing. Farmers would then move in with their wooden plows and livestock, scattering seed across the fertile sludge. The seeds would germinate quickly, their roots tapping into the stored moisture beneath the surface. This brilliant three-part cycle, filling, soaking, and draining, created a perfectly timed agricultural conveyor belt. It maximized the benefit of the short inundation season, ensuring that not a drop of water nor a particle of silt was wasted. The success of this system relied entirely on a harmonious, society-wide effort. It required the central authority of the pharaoh to organize the labor and maintenance, the skill of the surveyors to design and level the basins, and the coordinated work of thousands of farmers to manage the gates and tend the fields. The basin irrigation system was more than just a farming technique. It was the very embodiment of the Egyptian state, a physical manifestation of its power to bring order out of chaos and to secure the prosperity of its people for generations. But orchestrating this vast irrigation network and anticipating the needs of the coming year required more than just observation. It demanded precise, quantifiable data. The Egyptians needed to know, with as much advance warning as possible, exactly what kind of Nile was coming their way. To solve this critical problem, they engineered one of the most ingenious and spiritually significant instruments of the ancient world, the Nilometer. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a modern-day early warning system, a sophisticated device designed to take the vital signs of the river itself. These were not simple markers on a riverbank. A Nilometer was often an elaborate architectural feat, typically a deep, stone-lined well or a stairway that descended directly into the Nile, connected to the river by a small tunnel or aperture. This design allowed water to flow in and out freely, but it protected the measuring area from the river's turbulent currents, providing a calm, clear surface to obtain an accurate reading. Along the interior wall, meticulously carved cubit markings, the ancient Egyptian unit of measurement, roughly the length from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, created a giant, permanent ruler. Priests and government scribes would descend these steps day by day as the flood season approached, carefully recording the river's slow, steady climb. This was not just a scientific measurement, it was a sacred ritual, a way of communing with the god Hapi, the divine embodiment of the inundation, and gauging his mood for the coming season. The data collected from the Nilometer was far more than a simple number. It was the key that unlocked the entire kingdom's economic and agricultural strategy. The cubit markings were directly correlated to the expected harvest. A reading between 12 and 16 cubits was the sweet spot, the promise of a perfect Nile. This indicated that the floodwaters would be high enough to fill the basins and canals, depositing a rich layer of silt, but not so high as to become destructive. A measurement in this range sent a wave of relief and optimism throughout the land. It meant abundant grain, full granaries, and a prosperous year ahead. Conversely, a reading below 12 cubits signaled a low Nile and the imminent threat of drought and famine. A reading significantly above 16 cubits foretold a high Nile, a destructive deluge that could wipe out villages and infrastructure. This predictive power was invaluable. With this advanced notice, the central government in Memphis or Thebes could spring into action. If a low Nile was predicted, they could initiate rationing from state granaries, organize the distribution of seed grain to the most affected areas, and mobilize labor to deepen canals in a desperate attempt to channel what little water there was. If a destructively high flood was coming, they could order the reinforcement of dikes, organize the evacuation of low-lying settlements, and prepare for the massive reconstruction efforts that would follow. The Nilometer provided a crucial window of time, turning a potential catastrophe from a surprise attack into a managed, if still difficult, situation. This vital information also formed the bedrock of the ancient Egyptian tax system, creating a direct and logical link between the river's bounty and the state's revenue. The pharaoh's tax assessors, armed with the data from the Nilometer, could calculate with remarkable fairness what each community and landowner owed. After the floodwaters receded, these officials would travel throughout the Nile Valley, but their initial guide was the river's own measurement. A perfect flood level meant that farmers could expect a bumper crop, and therefore, the state could levy a higher tax, taking a larger share of the surplus to fund its vast projects, the building of temples, pyramids, and monuments, the maintenance of the army, and the salaries of the bureaucracy. If the Nilometer showed a low reading, predicting a poor harvest, the pharaoh could wisely choose to reduce or even forgive taxes for that year. This was an act of brilliant statecraft. It prevented overtaxing struggling farmers into destitution, which would have caused social unrest and crippled agricultural production for years to come. By tying tax rates directly to the measurable, objective power of the Nile, the system was perceived as fundamentally just. It was not the arbitrary whim of a greedy official, but the undeniable decree of the river god himself. The Nilometer, therefore, was more than a tool. It was the central gauge for the entire Egyptian economy, a physical instrument that translated the mysterious behavior of a river into actionable intelligence for survival, prosperity, and governance, ensuring that the entire civilization moved in rhythm with the life-giving, and sometimes terrifying, pulse of the Nile. Beyond the brilliant management of water for agriculture lay another layer of strategic genius, one permanently etched into the very landscape of Egypt. If you were to journey along the Nile in ancient times, you would notice a profound and deliberate pattern in the placement of its most vital centers of life. The sprawling cities and magnificent temples, the very hearts of political power and spiritual belief, were never built haphazardly along the riverbanks. Instead, they were positioned with a deep geographical intelligence that reveals a civilization constantly planning for its long-term survival. Look at the locations of the great capitals: Memphis in the north, the administrative hub of the Old Kingdom, and Thebes further south, the powerful home of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Neither was situated in a vulnerable, low-lying area directly at the river's mercy. They were established on naturally elevated ground, on the bluffs and plateaus that flanked the Nile Valley. This was a conscious choice, a fundamental principle of urban planning designed to keep the seats of government, the storehouses of grain, and the homes of the elite safe from the annual inundation. The goal was simple: to ensure that the administrative and religious machinery of the state could continue to function uninterrupted, even as the world below was transformed into a temporary sea. This elevated positioning created a powerful visual and practical separation between the productive, seasonal world of the floodplain and the permanent, unchanging world of power and the gods. This principle of elevation reaches its most symbolic and practical form in the construction of the temples. These were not merely houses of worship, they were considered the literal homes of the gods on earth, the axis upon which the universe turned. Their eternal stability was paramount, and the Egyptians went to extraordinary lengths to guarantee it. In many cases, if a perfect natural high point wasn't available, they would create one. They built their most sacred structures on massive artificial mounds known as tels. These were not simple piles of dirt. They were carefully constructed platforms made of layers of mud brick, stone, and rubble, raised high above the surrounding plain. The act of building on a mound was deeply symbolic, echoing the primeval mound of creation from Egyptian mythology, the first land to emerge from the chaotic waters of nothingness at the dawn of time. By building their temples on these raised platforms, they were reenacting the very moment of creation, establishing a pocket of perfect, divine order safe from the annual return of the watery chaos represented by the flood. This was a powerful fusion of practical necessity and spiritual belief. The temple, raised high, was a bastion of permanence in a world of cyclical change. When you visit these sites today, the success of this strategy is breathtakingly evident. Consider the magnificent temple complex of Karnak at Thebes. As you approach it, you walk up a gradual, often imperceptible incline. This is the result of centuries of deliberate construction and accumulation, raising the sacred precinct high above the river. For thousands of years, while the annual floodwaters swirled through the fields and canals below, the colossal columns, the grand hypostyle hall, and the inner sanctuaries of Karnak remained dry, secure, and functioning. The same is true for the Temple of Horus at Edfu, one of the best preserved temples in all of Egypt. It sits proudly on a foundation that has kept it safe for over 2 millennia. The priests conducting daily rituals, the festivals drawing crowds from across the region, the flow of offerings and tribute, none of this was disrupted by the inundation. This continuity was essential. The state's legitimacy was tied to the pharaoh's role as an intermediary with the gods. If the temples, the very conduits to the divine, were flooded and silenced, it would be seen as a catastrophic failure of the pharaoh to maintain Ma'at, or cosmic order. The survival of these temples through countless flood seasons was tangible proof that the system was working, that the gods were pleased, and that the civilization was in harmony with the forces of nature. This long-term foresight, this investment in foundational security, is a key reason why we can still walk through their halls today, marveling at inscriptions and paintings that have survived precisely because their builders had the wisdom to lift them just high enough to escape the river's annual embrace. Yet, even with the most sophisticated irrigation and the most accurate flood predictions, the Egyptians understood a fundamental truth about their world: the Nile's generosity was never guaranteed. All their brilliant systems could be rendered useless by a series of low, disappointing inundations. To survive such inevitable crises, they engineered one final, masterful layer of resilience, a tangible buffer against starvation that became the ultimate expression of state foresight: the national network of granaries. Think of these not as simple barns for storing grain, but as the pharaoh's strategic food reserves, the ancient world's most effective insurance policy against famine. This system transformed agriculture from a yearly gamble into a long-term, stable enterprise. The principle was straightforward, but required immense discipline and central coordination. A portion of every farmer's harvest, often collected as a form of tax in kind, was not immediately consumed or traded. Instead, it was systematically gathered and deposited into massive, state-controlled storage facilities. These granaries were architectural marvels in their own right, designed for maximum preservation. Many were large, mud-brick complexes with thick walls to insulate against the searing desert heat, raised floors to keep rodents and dampness at bay, and a series of small, high vents to allow for critical air circulation, preventing the stored grain from molding or fermenting. They were the banks of ancient Egypt, but instead of holding gold and silver, they safeguarded the true currency of life: emmer, wheat, and barley. The strategic placement of these granaries was as deliberate as the location of the temples. They were often built within the protected precincts of major temples or adjacent to royal administrative centers, like the sprawling complex uncovered at the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Rameses II in Thebes. This was a logistical and symbolic masterstroke. Attaching the granaries to temples provided them with a layer of divine protection and imbued the entire process of food storage with religious significance. It framed the act of setting aside a surplus not just as practical economics, but as a sacred duty, a collective offering to the gods to ensure future stability. More practically, it placed these vital reserves under the direct supervision of the priesthood and the state bureaucracy, the two most stable and organized institutions in the kingdom. This centralized control was essential for the system to function. Scribes maintained meticulous records on papyrus and ostraka, pottery shards used as notepads documenting every shipment of grain that came in and every measure that was distributed. They tracked the contents of each silo, the dates of deposit, and the names of the contributing farmers with an almost modern level of bureaucratic precision. This allowed the state to know, at any given moment, the exact size of its national food reserve. The true power of this system was revealed during the dreaded years of the low Nile. When the floodwaters failed to reach the necessary height, and the warning came from the Nilometers that a lean year was upon them, the entire agricultural cycle would stall. Fields would remain parched and cracked, and the normal harvest would be a fraction of its usual size. Without a stored surplus, this would trigger an immediate and devastating famine. But with the granary network in place, the pharaoh's government could activate a nationwide relief effort. The sealed doors of the storerooms would be opened, and the carefully preserved grain from the abundant years of the past would be methodically distributed. This state-sponsored rationing could mean the difference between life and death for millions. It allowed the population to be fed through the crisis, and just as importantly, it provided the seed grain needed to replant the following year, preventing a single bad year from spiraling into a multi-generational collapse. This capacity to smooth out the volatile swings of the natural world provided a profound sense of social and political stability. It demonstrated the pharaoh's fundamental role as the provider and protector of the people, physically proving his ability to maintain ma'at, or cosmic order, even when the natural world seemed to be descending into chaos. The granary system was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. It meant that the brilliant water management strategies and the accurate flood predictions had a safety net. Even if they failed to prevent a poor inundation, they had already stored the solution from the years of plenty. This long-term vision, this understanding that security lay not in a single good harvest, but in the wisdom to save for a bad one, cemented the legacy of a civilization that thought not in seasons, but in centuries. All these monumental feats of engineering the canals, the dikes, the basin systems share one common, vital ingredient. They required an immense, coordinated workforce, thousands of hands moving in unison, not by chance, but by design. This brings us to a cornerstone of ancient Egyptian society that transformed individual survival into a collective triumph, the corvée labor system. This was the mechanism that turned the seasonal pause in farming into a period of intense, nation-building activity. Think about the agricultural calendar we've discussed. For roughly 3 months each year, during the akhit or inundation season, the fields were submerged underwater. For a farmer, this was a mandatory period of downtime. There was no planting, no weeding, no harvesting to be done, but for the state, this was not a time for idleness. It was a golden opportunity. The state, personified by the pharaoh and his vast bureaucracy, possessed the authority to conscript this idle labor force for public works. This was the corvée, a form of tax paid not with grain or gold, but with physical labor. It was a mandatory, temporary duty that every able-bodied commoner was expected to perform. The logistical brilliance of this system is profound. By mobilizing the population precisely when their normal work was impossible, the Egyptians avoided crippling their agricultural output. They weren't pulling farmers away from their plows during the critical planting or harvest seasons. Instead, they were channeling their energy during a natural lull, effectively creating a national workforce that materialized for a few months each year and then returned to their villages when the waters receded and the land was ready for sowing. This cycle created a perfect symbiosis between the rhythm of the river and the needs of the state. The very flood that made farming impossible was the same event that freed up the labor to build the infrastructure that made farming more productive and secure the rest of the year. It was a virtuous cycle of mutual reinforcement. So, what did this army of conscripted laborers actually do? Their work was the literal maintenance of civilization. A large portion of them were dispatched to the riverbanks and the edges of the floodplain to maintain and expand the very systems we've been exploring. They would arrive at the canals with shovels and baskets made of reeds, digging out the accumulated silt from the previous year's flood to ensure a clear flow of water for the next. They would work in teams, packing mud and stones to reinforce the massive earthen dikes, repairing the breaches that had been intentionally opened during the last inundation. This was not glamorous work. It was hot, difficult, and muddy, but it was essential preventative maintenance. A single neglected canal or a weakened dike could lead to localized flooding or drought, putting an entire community's food supply at risk. The work of the corvée labor was the constant physical effort that kept the entire hydraulic system functioning smoothly year after year, generation after generation. And yes, this is also the very same labor system that was harnessed for the most iconic construction projects in human history, the pyramids and the great temples. We often picture slaves toiling under the whip to build the Great Pyramid of Giza, but modern archaeological evidence overwhelmingly points to a workforce of conscripted Egyptian laborers, the corvée in action. These men were not slaves. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen fulfilling their civic duty. During the inundation season, when the Nile's high waters made transporting massive stone blocks by barge considerably easier, they would be called up for service. They were housed in nearby laborer villages, like the one discovered at Giza, where they received rations of bread, beer, and fish. Essentially, they were paid in sustenance. Their work on the pyramids was, in a very real sense, another form of public works project, albeit one of unparalleled scale and spiritual significance. Building a pharaoh's tomb was seen as a collective act that ensured the continued favor of the gods and the stability of the cosmos itself. The corvée system, therefore, was the backbone of both practical infrastructure and monumental ideology. It wove together the daily life of the common farmer with the eternal ambitions of the state, creating a society where every individual, through their seasonal labor, contributed directly to the resilience and the glory of Egypt. All of these survival strategies, from the shaduf to the granaries, share one critical dependency: they all had to be enacted at exactly the right moment. The success of the entire civilization hinged on timing, and to master time itself, the ancient Egyptians looked upward, developing an understanding of the cosmos so precise it became the very clockwork of their survival. They didn't just observe the stars for mythology, they used them as a practical, predictive tool, creating a calendar system that was seamlessly synchronized with the life cycle of the Nile. This celestial observation gave rise to a brilliantly pragmatic division of their year. They developed a 365-day calendar, one of the first in history, and they split it not into arbitrary months, but into 3 distinct seasons, each defined entirely by the river's behavior and the agricultural work it demanded. The first season was Akhit, the inundation. This was the time of the Great Flood, when the Nile overflowed its banks and the valley transformed into that vast, inland sea, lasting from roughly July to October. As the waters receded, they entered the second season, Perit, meaning emergence or growth. This was when the land, now coated in rich, black silt, emerged from the water, and the frantic work of planting began, stretching from November to February. Finally came Shemu, the harvest season, a period of intense labor under the increasingly hot sun from March to June, when the grain was cut, threshed, and stored away in the state granaries. This calendar was more than a way to mark days. It was a national schedule, a divine and administrative roadmap that told every person in the kingdom what they should be doing and when, creating a society-wide rhythm that was perfectly attuned to the environment. But a 365-day calendar has a subtle, creeping problem. A true solar year is actually about 6 hours longer than 365 days. This means that over time, a fixed calendar slowly drifts out of sync with the actual seasons. For the Egyptians, whose entire existence was tied to a specific seasonal event, the flood, this was a potentially catastrophic flaw. A calendar that said it was Akhit while the river remained low and the fields were dry, would undermine the entire predictive infrastructure of the state. Their solution to this immense philosophical and practical challenge reveals their profound dedication to accuracy. They discovered a celestial event so reliable, so perfectly locked in with the Nile's behavior, that it could reset their calendar and provide an infallible long-term forecast, the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet. This was one of their greatest astronomical achievements. The heliacal rising is the first day each year when a star becomes visible just above the eastern horizon for a brief moment before the light of the rising sun washes it out. For Sirius, this annual reappearance occurred in mid-July, and it coincided with uncanny precision with the very beginning of the Nile's annual swell. The connection was so direct and so vital that the Egyptians came to believe the floodwaters were brought forth by the tears of the goddess Isis, who was associated with Sirius, weeping for her slain husband Osiris. In the pre-dawn darkness of that crucial day, priests and astronomers would scan the eastern horizon. The moment they caught that first, fleeting glimpse of the dog star, they would send messengers racing across the land, proclaiming the news: the new year had begun and the inundation was on its way. This was the starting pistol for the entire civilization, triggering the corvée labor, the final checks on the dikes and canals, and the spiritual preparations for the coming of Happy. This celestial observation also allowed them to comprehend and track the grand, majestic cycle that governed their calendar's drift, the Sothic cycle. They realized that their 365-day civil calendar and the slightly longer solar year, marked by Sirius, would slowly march out of phase. It took exactly 1,461 of their civil years for the two calendars to realign perfectly. This vast period, 1,461 years, is what we now call the Sothic cycle. Understanding this cycle was a monumental intellectual feat. It meant that the Egyptian scribes and astronomers were not confused by their calendar's gradual drift. They understood its mechanics on a scale of centuries. They could track where they were within this immense cycle and knew that the heliacal rising of Sirius would always, eventually, return to its correct place in their civil calendar. This long-term perspective granted them an incredible predictive power that transcended the life of any single pharaoh or dynasty. They could anticipate the flood's arrival with a confidence that no other contemporary civilization possessed, turning the terrifying uncertainty of the river into a scheduled, manageable event. This fusion of precise astronomy with daily survival using the predictable motion of a distant star to plan the excavation of a canal or the opening of a granary is a stunning example of how the ancient Egyptians wove the fabric of the cosmos into the very practical tapestry of their enduring civilization. But all these grand systems, the Nilometers, the canals, the granaries, required a single, guiding intelligence to coordinate them, a human mind capable of overseeing the entire, complex operation. This vital role fell to one of the most powerful figures in ancient Egypt, second only to the pharaoh himself, the vizier. Think of the vizier not just as a prime minister, but as the nation's chief executive officer of disaster management and agricultural logistics. While the pharaoh was the divine symbol of stability, it was the vizier who translated that divine mandate into practical, day-to-day action, ensuring the intricate machinery of the state functioned smoothly, especially when confronted with the annual challenge of the inundation. His duties were vast, but at their very core was one overarching priority: the management of the Nile and its life-giving, yet dangerous, flood. The vizier's responsibilities were explicitly outlined in a set of ancient instructions, a kind of job description carved into the wall of the tomb of a vizier named Rekhmire, who served under Pharaoh Thutmose III. These texts give us an incredible window into the immense importance placed on flood management. One passage commands the vizier directly: It is he who shall order every irrigation canal to be opened. It is he who shall set the boundaries of the marshes and the fields. This was not a suggestion, it was a sacred charge. The vizier was the ultimate authority on water. He received daily reports from the priests and scribes manning the Nilometers up and down the river. This data flowed into his office, allowing him to build a national picture of the flood's progress. He didn't just wait for the water to arrive, he proactively dispatched teams of surveyors and engineers to inspect the vast network of dikes and canals, ensuring they were sound and ready for the coming surge. A single weak spot in a dike or a canal clogged with silt could lead to localized disaster, and the vizier bore the responsibility for preventing it. His role extended far beyond the riverbanks. The same instructions charged the vizier with the oversight of the kingdom's granaries, stating he must be vigilant over the provisions in the granaries. He was the keeper of the nation's food insurance policy. His scribes maintained the meticulous records of every shipment of grain that entered the state storage facilities, and it was the vizier who had the authority to authorize distributions during a famine. He was also the master of the corvée labor system. It was his administration that organized the massive, seasonal workforce, ensuring that when the floodwaters rose and the farmers were idle, there were enough hands available to repair dikes, dredge canals, and work on the pharaoh's monumental building projects. The vizier was the central node connecting every strand of the survival strategy. He interpreted the river's behavior through the Nilometer data, he commanded the infrastructure through the maintenance of canals and dikes, and he managed the human and food resources through the labor and granary systems. This position required a remarkable blend of skills. The vizier had to be part hydrologist, part logistician, part accountant, and part judge. He held daily audiences where regional governors, mayors, and farmers could bring their disputes, many of which undoubtedly involved water rights, field boundaries washed away by the flood, or access to irrigation channels. His ability to adjudicate these conflicts fairly was essential for maintaining social order and agricultural productivity. The entire philosophy of his role is perfectly captured in another line from the instructions to the vizier: "It is an abomination of the god to show partiality." This emphasis on impartiality and justice was critical. In a society where survival hinged on the fair distribution of water and food, the perception that the vizier was corrupt or favoring one region over another could shatter the public's trust in the entire system and lead to unrest. The vizier, therefore, was the living embodiment of the principle of Ma'at, cosmic order and balance. His effective governance ensured that the chaos of the annual flood was transformed into a force for organized, predictable abundance, proving that the strength of Egypt lay not just in its bricks and canals, but in the brilliant, centralized administration that made it all work in perfect harmony. With the entire landscape prepared by the flood and managed by human ingenuity, the stage was perfectly set for the next act in this grand seasonal drama, the planting of the crops that would become the literal bread and beer of Egypt. The Egyptians didn't just grow any plants, they cultivated species that had evolved over millennia to thrive in the specific conditions the inundation created. This was a masterclass in agricultural symbiosis, where the natural cycle of the river and the chosen crops became perfect partners. The two superstar grains of the ancient Egyptian diet were emmer wheat and barley. These weren't the modern varieties we know today. Emmer wheat, a hardy ancestor of durum wheat, produced a dense, nutritious grain that was laborious to thresh but could be stored for years without spoiling, a vital trait for a civilization that relied on granaries. Barley was slightly less fussy and could tolerate poorer soil conditions and a bit more salinity, acting as a reliable backup if the wheat harvest was less abundant. These two grains were so fundamental that they formed the basis of the Egyptian economy. Workers from the pyramids to the royal tombs were often paid in rations of bread and beer. both made from emmer and barley. The planting process itself was a beautiful illustration of efficiency, perfectly timed to the rhythm of the receding waters. As the Nile withdrew from the vast basin network, it left behind a landscape that was, for a few precious weeks, an agricultural utopia. The soil wasn't just damp, it was a deep, saturated slurry of the finest black silt, a natural fertilizer deposited by the river from the highlands of Ethiopia. This eliminated the need for the back-breaking labor of manuring fields or even deep plowing that was common in other ancient agricultural societies. Farmers would simply walk onto the soft, ready earth, often following behind a pair of oxen or cows pulling a simple wooden plow known as an ard. This wasn't a plow designed to turn the soil over deeply. It was a scratch plow, essentially a pointed piece of wood that carved a shallow furrow into the rich mud. Its job wasn't to prepare the ground, because the flood had already done that. Its purpose was simply to open a narrow trench for the seeds. Right behind the plow, another farmer would follow, carrying a basket of seed and scattering it liberally into the fresh furrows. To ensure the seeds weren't eaten by birds or simply washed away, a herd of sheep or goats would often be driven across the field, their hooves trampling the seeds securely into the fertile, wet muck. This entire process was remarkably low effort and high yield, a direct benefit of the perfectly managed inundation. Once the seeds were in the ground, the genius of the Basin Irrigation system truly revealed itself. Because the land had been so thoroughly saturated for over a month, the soil acted like a giant, slow-release reservoir of moisture. For the entire growing season of Perit, which lasted from November through February, the crops of emmer and barley rarely, if ever, needed additional watering from a shaduf or a canal. The roots of the young plants would tap into this stored groundwater, drawing sustenance directly from the reserves the river had left behind. This passive irrigation system freed up an enormous amount of labor. Farmers didn't need to spend their days hauling water. They could focus on protecting the young shoots from pests, weeding the fields, and maintaining the irrigation infrastructure for the following year. The entire growth cycle was a race against the drying sun. As the weeks of Perit turned into the hot, dry days of Shemu, the harvest season, the grain would ripen perfectly, golden and ready, just as the last of the soil's residual moisture was depleted. It was a cycle of breathtaking synchronicity. The flood provided the water and the fertilizer, the crops grew using that stored bounty, and they were harvested just as the natural resources were exhausted, ready for the entire process to begin again with the next inundation. This wasn't just farming, it was a flawless, natural partnership between the river and the people, a partnership that produced the surplus that built a civilization. While the floodwaters transformed farmland into a temporary sea, they did not bring life to a standstill. In fact, they triggered a remarkable shift in how the entire civilization moved and connected. With the familiar footpaths and dry land caravan routes swallowed by the churning brown water, the landscape was fundamentally rewired, but the ancient Egyptians were prepared for this annual metamorphosis. They possessed a technology that turned this period of potential isolation into a season of unprecedented mobility, a sophisticated and versatile maritime culture. Boats and barges did not merely serve as a substitute for travel, they became the absolute lifeblood of the kingdom during the inundation, the only reliable method for transporting goods, people, and information across a nation that had literally become a network of interconnected lakes and waterways. The Nile, in its swollen state, was no longer just a river, it was a liquid superhighway, and the Egyptians were master navigators of this expanded domain. The types of vessels plying these waters were as diverse as their functions, each designed with a specific purpose in mind. For everyday local travel and fishing, Egyptians relied on graceful skiffs made from bundles of papyrus reeds. These lightweight boats, often propelled by poles in the shallow, flooded fields, were the workhorses of the flood season, allowing farmers to check on submerged field markers, tend to livestock, move to higher ground, and visit neighboring villages that were now effectively islands. For more substantial cargo and long-distance travel, they constructed robust wooden boats. Using imported cedar from Lebanon and local acacia wood, Egyptian shipwrights mastered advanced techniques like mortise and tenon joinery, creating strong, seaworthy vessels capable of navigating the powerful currents of the fully flooded Nile. The most iconic of these were the elegant sailing boats, with their single large square sail, perfectly designed to catch the prevailing northerly winds and sail south, upstream against the current. To travel north downstream, they could simply lower the sail and let the current carry them, a brilliantly efficient system that harnessed the natural forces of wind and water. Then there were the massive, ponderous cargo barges, the heavy freight trains of the ancient world. These were the vessels that truly underpinned the economy during the inundation, capable of carrying immense loads, from the giant stone blocks for the pharaoh's monuments to the vast quantities of grain collected as tax and destined for the state granaries. This shift to water-based transport during Akhit supercharged the Egyptian economy in ways that would have been impossible during the dry season. Imagine the difficulty of moving a 200-ton granite obelisk from a quarry in Aswan to a temple in Thebes overland. It would require an immense, slow-moving convoy, a massive workforce to clear and level a path, and the construction of a durable road. Now, picture that same obelisk being loaded onto a specially built barge during the high flood. The elevated water levels brought the quarry face closer to the river, and the expanded, deeper channels allowed the barge to float that colossal weight directly to its destination with dramatically less human effort. The floodwaters did the heavy lifting. This principle applied to all forms of commerce. The grain harvested just before the inundation, now stored in local silos, could be efficiently collected by barges that moved from village to village, their holds filling with the tax that would feed the kingdom. Trade goods, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt, all flowed along this liquid network with renewed ease. Far from being a time of economic stagnation, the inundation became a peak period for the distribution of resources, a time when the central government could most effectively gather the surplus from the entire land and redistribute it to where it was needed most. This maritime mobility also forged a stronger social and political bond between the distant provinces of Upper and Lower Egypt. With land travel severed, the river became the primary conduit for communication and control. Royal messengers, standing proudly on swift government vessels, could carry decrees from the pharaoh's court to the most remote regional governors with a speed and reliability that foot messengers could never achieve. This ensured that the will of the state was communicated and enacted uniformly, preventing regional powers from becoming too isolated or independent during the flood. Administrators and tax collectors could travel their circuits by boat, and soldiers could be rapidly deployed by river to quell any unrest or secure a border. This constant fluid connection reinforced a shared Egyptian identity. A trader from Memphis, sailing south during the inundation, would witness the same watery world, the same rituals, and the same challenges faced by a farmer in Thebes. The shared experience of the flood and the shared technology of the boat wove the two lands together into a cohesive whole, proving that the very force that could have divided them instead became their greatest unifying artery. While we often marvel at the towering pyramids and colossal stone temples of ancient Egypt, the true genius of their architectural adaptation to the Nile's floods is found in a much humbler, yet infinitely more practical, material, the mud brick. For the everyday people, the farmers, artisans, and officials who lived and worked along the river, their homes, workshops, and even palace walls were not built from eternal stone. but from the very earth the flood deposited each year. This was a deliberate and profound choice, born from a deep understanding of their environment. The primary recipe for a mud brick was elegantly simple, a direct gift from the river itself. Workers would gather the thick, black Nile silt, mix it with water and a binding agent like straw or sand to prevent cracking, and then pack this malleable clay into wooden molds. These raw bricks would then be left to bake hard and durable under the intense Egyptian sun. The entire process was a cycle of local abundance. The Nile provided the mud for free, the fields provided the straw, and the sun provided the kiln. This meant that the fundamental building block of entire cities was astonishingly cheap and available to almost everyone, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest noble. The advantages of this material extended far beyond its cost and accessibility. It was, in essence, an architecture designed for resilience in the face of constant change. When the annual inundation came, even the best-built earthen walls could suffer. A particularly high flood might weaken a foundation, wash away a lower course of bricks, or even collapse a wall entirely. But with mud brick, this was not a catastrophe, it was a manageable repair job. Since the raw materials were literally under their feet, a family or a community could quickly and easily patch damaged sections, rebuild a fallen wall, or even raise the entire level of their home to prepare for future floods. This stands in stark contrast to a stone structure where a single collapsed wall would require a massive quarrying and transportation effort to fix. The Egyptian approach to domestic architecture was one of acceptance and practicality. They understood that the homes of the living were temporary in the grand scheme of things, subject to the cycles of nature, decay, and renewal. A house was not meant to last for 1,000 years, it was meant to provide safe, comfortable shelter for a generation or two, and then be readily replaced or rebuilt as needed. This philosophy created a living, breathing urban landscape that could adapt and evolve with the river's moods, an architecture that bent rather than broke under pressure. This pragmatic use of mud brick creates a fascinating and intentional duality when we compare it to the other great building tradition of ancient Egypt, the use of stone for tombs and temples. This was not a case of one material being superior to the other, rather, it was a conscious allocation based on spiritual purpose and the concept of eternity. Tombs, like the pyramids in the vast royal necropolises, and temples, like the great complex at Karnak, were designed as houses for the gods and vessels for the eternal soul, the Ka. Their function demanded permanence, an unchanging stability that could defy the ravages of time, weather, and even the Nile's floods. This is why they were constructed from granite, limestone, and sandstone materials quarried with immense effort, transported over great distances, and carved to last forever. The very essence of these structures was to exist outside the natural cycles of decay that governed the mortal world. A temple flooded was a theological crisis, a tomb damaged was an assault on eternity itself. This material dichotomy reflects the core of the Egyptian worldview, a clear division between the transient world of the living and the eternal realm of the gods and the dead. The bustling cities of the living, with their sun-dried mud brick walls, were vibrant but impermanent. They rose, were damaged, repaired, and eventually returned to the earth, much like the annual crops in the fields. Meanwhile, the silent, stark monuments of the necropolises, built in the desert beyond the fertile floodplain, were intended as eternal statements. They were anchors of permanence in a cyclical world. So, when we look at the archaeological record, the near-total disappearance of ancient Egyptian towns and houses is not a sign of failure. It is, in fact, proof of the success of their adaptive strategy. They chose the right material for the right purpose. They invested their immense collective labor in permanent stone for the divine and the eternal, while wisely using practical, repairable mud brick for the temporal needs of daily life. This balanced approach allowed them to channel their resources into timeless monuments without sacrificing the flexibility needed to survive and thrive along the unpredictable, life-giving Nile. But for all their engineering brilliance and administrative foresight, the ancient Egyptians understood that some forces were too vast, too mysterious, to be managed by human hands alone. The river's ultimate behavior, whether it would bring life-giving abundance or catastrophic ruin, resided in a realm beyond canals and granaries. This is where we enter the profound spiritual dimension of their survival strategy, a world where religion and magic were not mere superstition, but essential tools for navigating an unpredictable universe. At the heart of this spiritual defense stood a powerful, paradoxical deity, Hapi, the god of the annual inundation. Unlike the stern, judgmental gods of other pantheons, Hapi was a figure of benevolent, generative power, celebrated as the lord of the fishes and the birds of the marshes. He was depicted as a large, androgynous figure with pendulous breasts and a swollen belly, symbols of fertility and abundance, often colored blue or green to represent the life-giving water. He wore a crown of papyrus and lotus plants, the very flora that thrived in the renewed marshlands left by the flood. Hapi was not the river itself, but its vital, animating spirit, the force that caused the waters to rise from the mystical caverns of the underworld, bringing the precious silt that was the literal substance of life to the fields of Egypt. His arrival was eagerly anticipated, his favor desperately sought, for a world without Hapi's annual gift was a world condemned to starvation and silence. To secure this divine favor, the Egyptians engaged in elaborate, state-sponsored rituals and festivals designed to appeal directly to Hapi and the other gods who influenced the river's flow. The most significant of these was the Night of the Teardrop, a ceremony timed to the heliacal rising of Sirius. According to myth, the floodwaters were brought forth by the tears of the goddess Isis, who wept for her murdered husband, Osiris. The annual reappearance of Sirius, associated with Isis, signaled the moment her grief began to overflow, filling the river with her sorrow. Priests would lead solemn processions to the river's edge, carrying sacred statues and offering hymns, prayers, and lavish sacrifices, gold, jewelry, and the choicest cuts of meat that were cast directly into the rising waters as a direct appeal to Hapi. This was more than just a prayer, it was a transactional act, a divine bargain. By giving the gods the finest things they possessed, the Egyptians believed they were encouraging the gods to reciprocate with a bountiful and perfectly balanced inundation. In the capital cities, the pharaoh himself, as the intermediary between the people and the gods, would perform a key ritual. He would throw a papyrus scroll into the river, inscribed with commands for the Nile to rise to its ideal level. This act was a powerful piece of sympathetic magic, a way of using the pharaoh's divine authority to command the natural world, reinforcing the belief that the state, through its religious rites, held real sway over the forces of nature. On a more local community level, every village and town had its own ways of honoring and placating the river's spirit. As the floodwaters began to recede and the land emerged, small, heartfelt offerings were made directly into the canals and irrigation ditches. Farmers would toss simple clay figurines shaped like animals or fertility symbols, or pour libations of beer and bread into the water, a humble thank you for the moisture and silt that would nourish their crops. These practices reveal a deeply personal relationship with the divine, a sense that every individual had a role to play in maintaining the cosmic balance. This spiritual framework provided something that engineering and astronomy alone could not, a profound sense of psychological control and understanding. The unpredictability of the Nile was terrifying. A bad flood year could feel like a random, meaningless catastrophe, but by attributing the river's behavior to the will of the gods, the Egyptians transformed a chaotic natural event into a comprehensible relational dynamic. A destructive flood wasn't a random accident, it was a sign that the gods were angry, that rituals had been performed incorrectly, or that Ma'at had been disrupted by human misdeeds. Conversely, a perfect flood was proof of divine favor, a reward for their piety and the pharaoh's effectiveness. This belief system gave them a narrative, a reason for the events that shaped their lives. It provided a clear course of action, more fervent prayer, more lavish offerings, greater moral rectitude, to potentially influence the outcome of the next inundation. In a world full of unanswerable questions, their religion provided the answers, turning the terrifying power of the Nile into a dialogue with the divine, a spiritual partnership that was just as critical to their survival as the shaduf or the granary. Now, this profound connection between the river's behavior and divine will find its most perfect and personified expression in the god Hapi himself. He stands apart in the Egyptian pantheon, not as a fearsome ruler of the underworld or a distant sky deity, but as the very embodiment of the inundation's life-giving power. His unique iconography is instantly recognizable and rich with symbolism. Artists and sculptors depicted Hapi as a plump, androgynous figure, often with a rounded, heavy belly and pendulous breasts, a deliberate representation of abundance and nourishment. He wasn't portrayed with the idealized, athletic physique of a king or warrior. His body was a testament to fertility itself, the source from which all bounty flowed. His skin was typically painted blue or green, the colors of water and revitalizing vegetation, and he was frequently shown bringing together the two iconic plants of Upper and Lower Egypt, the papyrus and the lotus, tying them around a central emblem that represented the union of the two lands. This imagery powerfully communicated that Hapi's gift was for all of Egypt, a force that bound the entire kingdom together in shared dependence and prosperity. In his hands, he often carries trays overflowing with offerings of food and produce, but these weren't gifts for the other gods. They were the gifts he himself was bestowing upon the land, the produce of the field made manifest by his arrival. The rituals dedicated to Hapi were among the most vital and anxiously observed in the Egyptian religious calendar. As the time for the inundation approached, priests and state officials would lead elaborate processions to the river's edge. These weren't quiet, somber affairs, but vibrant, hopeful celebrations filled with music, chanting, and the palpable anticipation of the entire community. The air would be thick with the smoke of incense and the sound of hymns specifically composed to praise Hapi and plead for his benevolence. One such hymn, preserved from the New Kingdom, captures this spirit of supplication perfectly. Hail to you, Hapi! Sprung from earth, come to nourish Egypt, he who floods the fields that Ra has created to nourish all who thirst, he who gives drink to the desert. Secret of nature whom the gods have made, who comes with the flood to nourish Egypt, these words were not just poetry, they were a direct invocation, a magical and spiritual effort to coax the god into action. The most crucial part of the ceremony involved the casting of lavish offerings directly into the rising waters. Precious items, including gold, jewelry, and written prayers on papyrus, were given to the river, a tangible sacrifice meant to secure an even greater return, a perfect, life-sustaining flood. This direct link between Hapi's favor and the kingdom's survival made the condition of the Nile the ultimate barometer of divine satisfaction. A good Nile, one that rose to the ideal level of 12 to 16 cubits on the Nilometer, was interpreted as a clear and joyous manifestation of Hapi's pleasure. It was seen as the god's affirmative response to the people's piety, the pharaoh's righteousness, and the proper performance of the state rituals. Such a flood meant that Ma'at, the essential order of the universe, was in balance. The fields would be perfectly saturated, the silt deposited evenly, and the granaries would be filled to overflowing. This was more than just good luck, it was a theological victory, a sign that the relationship between the people and the divine was harmonious and strong. Conversely, a bad Nile's, whether too high or too low, was a terrifying omen. It was read as a sign of Happy's displeasure, or, even worse, a symptom of a deeper cosmic imbalance. The gods were angry, and the reason had to be discovered. Perhaps a crucial ritual had been performed incorrectly. Maybe the pharaoh had failed in his duties, or the people had strayed from the path of moral rectitude. This spiritual interpretation of natural events provided a framework for understanding catastrophe. It transformed a potentially random, meaningless disaster into a comprehensible, if frightening, divine message. In this worldview, a failed flood wasn't just a hydrological problem to be solved with better canals. It was a spiritual crisis that demanded collective atonement, more fervent prayer, and a renewed commitment to upholding the principles that kept their world in harmony. The fate of the harvest, and therefore the survival of the civilization, was inextricably woven into this ongoing dialogue with a God who is both generous and demanding, a force of nature made divine. While the Egyptians celebrated Happy's generosity, they never forgot that the Nile held a darker, more menacing power. For every fertile field and life-giving canal, there was a hidden, lurking danger, a reminder of the chaos that lay just beneath the river's placid surface. This terrifying duality found its ultimate expression in the crocodile god, Sobek. Where Happy was the god of the flood's life-giving potential, Sobek was the god of its raw, untamed, and predatory reality. In the swamps and along the riverbanks, the Nile crocodile was the undisputed king and ambush predator of immense size and strength, capable of dragging a full-grown ox to its death. This creature, which could bask harmlessly on a mud bank one moment and explode into a violent frenzy the next, perfectly embodied the river's dual nature. It was a source of life, but it was also an immediate and ever-present threat of sudden, violent death. The Egyptians, in their profound understanding of nature, did not shy away from this terrifying aspect. Instead, they personified it, worshipped it, and sought to turn its fearsome power to their advantage. By deifying the crocodile as Sobek, they transformed a source of primal fear into a divine force that could, if properly respected and appeased, become a protector. The worship of Sobek was concentrated in places where crocodiles were most prevalent, particularly in the marshy, fertile Fayum region, where the city of Shedit, known to the Greeks as Crocodilopolis, served as his primary cult center. Here, the relationship between man and God reached its most intimate and astonishing form. The priests of Sobek would select a single, magnificent crocodile to be the living incarnation of the god himself. This sacred animal, named Petsuchos, meaning he of Sobek, was not feared or hunted. It was adorned with gold and jeweled earrings, housed in a specially built temple pond, and fed a diet of choice meats, bread, and honeyed wine presented by the priests on golden platters. To care for the Petsuchos was to serve Sobek directly, a divine duty that they believed would secure the god's favor for the entire community. When this living incarnation eventually died, it was mummified with the same meticulous care as a pharaoh, wrapped in fine linen and placed in a stone sarcophagus, and a new crocodile was chosen to take its place. This practice reveals a sophisticated theological strategy. By treating the most fearsome embodiment of the river's danger with the highest possible honor, they sought to domesticate its fury, to convince the chaotic force it represented to guard their city and its people rather than destroy them. One of the most striking architectural testaments to this strategy of appeasement stands at Kam Ombo, a unique double temple perched dramatically on a high bend of the Nile. This temple is not dedicated to one god, but to two equally powerful and contrasting deities, Horus the Elder, the falcon-headed sky god of kingship and order, and Sobek, the crocodile god of fertility and chaos. The entire structure is perfectly symmetrical, with duplicate sets of halls, sanctuaries, and reliefs, one side for each god. This architectural balance was a profound philosophical statement carved in stone. It physically represented the Egyptian understanding that their world was a constant, necessary equilibrium between two opposing forces: the predictable, celestial order of Horus and the untamed, fertile chaos of Sobek and his river. They recognized that you could not have one without the other. Too much order, and the world becomes sterile and rigid; too much chaos, and it descends into violence and ruin. The inundation itself was the perfect example of this balance, a chaotic, destructive event that was absolutely necessary for creating life-giving order. Within the Sobek side of the temple at Kamambo, archaeologists discovered a chilling and direct link to this strategy of appeasement: a subterranean crypt filled with hundreds of mummified crocodiles. These were not the single venerated Petsuchos of Crocodilopolis, but a collective offering. Egyptians would bring mummified crocodiles, ranging from giant adults to tiny hatchlings, as votive gifts to the god. The logic was powerful and direct. By offering Sobek the body of his own sacred animal, carefully preserved and presented with reverence, they were performing a supreme act of devotion. It was a way of saying, "We respect your power so deeply that we honor your earthly form in death. Please, in return, spare us from your wrath." This was a tangible effort to mitigate the daily dangers of the river: the sudden attack while drawing water, the loss of livestock, the fear that accompanied every boat journey through crocodile-infested waters. Their survival strategy, therefore, was not a naive belief in a purely benevolent nature. It was a comprehensive, multi-layered approach that combined brilliant engineering with deep spiritual pragmatism. They built dikes to hold back the physical water, and they built temples to Sobek to hold back the river's metaphorical and very real jaws. They understood that to truly thrive along the Nile, you had to honor both its nourishing heart and its sharp teeth. And so, this world of stark duality, of life-giving floods and lurking crocodilian dangers, found its ultimate, unifying story, a grand mythological narrative that gave profound meaning to the entire Egyptian experience. This is the story of Osiris, a myth that didn't just explain the world, but actively shaped the Egyptian soul, providing a timeless blueprint for resilience in the face of loss and a powerful promise of renewal. At its heart, the myth of Osiris is a story of murder, grief, and miraculous rebirth, a cosmic drama that played out every single year along the banks of the Nile, etching the pattern of death and life directly into the landscape and the hearts of the people. The story begins with Osiris as a beloved king, a bringer of civilization who taught the Egyptians the arts of agriculture, law, and worship. He was a figure of order and fertile abundance, a golden age personified. Yet this very goodness provoked the envy of his brother, Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the harsh, barren desert. In a brutal act of betrayal, Set murdered Osiris, sealing him inside a decorated chest and casting it into the Nile. The great bringer of life was dead, his body lost to the very waters he had once taught men to harness. This was the mythological equivalent of the Nile's low period, the moment of despair when the river shrank, the land baked under the sun, and the specter of famine loomed. The death of the god-king was a cosmic catastrophe, a shattering of the established order, but the story does not end there. It is what happens next that reveals the true depth of the Egyptian spirit. Osiris's wife and sister, the goddess Isis, embarked on a desperate, epic quest to find his body. Her grief was monumental, a divine sorrow that echoed across the world. After a long search, she finally discovered the chest lodged in a tamarisk tree in the far-off land of Byblos. She brought her husband's body back to Egypt, and through her powerful magic, she was able to conceive a son, Horus, the falcon-headed god, who would later avenge his father. However, in a final act of cruelty, Set found the body of Osiris, dismembered it into 14 pieces, and scattered them across the length of Egypt. This horrific act, the dismemberment of the god of fertility, is a chilling parallel to the parched, cracked earth of the late dry season, a land utterly broken and scattered, its life force seemingly gone forever. Yet again, Isis refused to accept this chaos. With the help of her sister Nephthys, she tirelessly searched for every piece of her husband, traveling to every nome, every district of the country. Wherever she found a part of Osiris, she and the local people would erect a shrine. This sacred journey wove the story of the god directly into the geography of Egypt itself, making every community a guardian of a piece of the divine puzzle. Finally, having collected all the pieces, all except one, symbolically lost to the Nile, Isis used her profound magic to reassemble Osiris, wrapping him in linen bandages and thus performing the first act of mummification. Through her love and power, she temporarily reanimated him, long enough to conceive their heir, Horus, but Osiris could not return to the land of the living. Instead, he descended to become the righteous ruler of the underworld, the judge of the dead, and the Lord of eternal life. His resurrection was not a return to his old life, but a transformation into a new, permanent state of power and authority over the cycle of death and rebirth. This entire epic is a direct, powerful allegory for the Nile's annual cycle. The murder of Osiris and the scattering of his body represent the retreat of the floodwaters and the subsequent drying and cracking of the land, the death of the fertile season. The grieving search of Isis mirrors the anxious, desperate period of waiting, when the Egyptians looked to the sky for the star Sirius and prayed for the flood's return. The tears she shed for her husband were believed to be the very source of the inundation, the divine sorrow that filled the river and made the land live again. The reassembly of Osiris's body is the miraculous resurrection of the fertile land itself, as the Nile's waters return, piece by piece, covering the scattered, desiccated earth and stitching it back together into a single, cohesive, and life-giving whole. Just as Osiris was restored to a new, eternal life in the underworld, the land of Egypt did not merely return, it was reborn, fresh, fertile, and more vibrant than before, ready to sprout new life from the rich black silt. This myth provided more than just an explanation, it provided a profound sense of comfort and purpose. It taught that death was not an end, but a necessary step in a greater cycle of renewal. It showed that even in the face of terrible loss, symbolized by the low Nile and the threat of famine, persistent love, unwavering effort, and magical ingenuity, the attributes of Isis could ultimately triumph over chaos. Every farmer who sowed seeds in the mud understood he was reenacting this divine drama, burying something that seemed dead into the body of Osiris Earth, trusting in the promise that it would be resurrected into new life. This narrative framework transformed their struggle for survival from a mere battle against nature into a sacred participation in the cosmos itself, reinforcing a cultural resilience that was as deep and enduring as the river that shaped it. Despite their brilliant foresight and sophisticated systems, the ancient Egyptians were never fully insulated from the raw, untamed power of their river. The very Nilometer records and inscriptions that celebrated years of perfect abundance also bear silent, chilling witness to periods when the entire system failed, when the Nile delivered not life, but catastrophe. Geological core samples taken from the Nile, Delta, and the river's floodplain reveal dramatic layers of coarse sand and gravel, sediments deposited by floodwaters of such immense force that they far exceeded the capacity of any dike or canal. At other times, the geological record shows layers of wind-blown sand, indicating centuries where the annual flood simply failed to materialize and the desert began to reclaim the valley. These physical traces in the earth are corroborated by the desperate voices from the past, Inscriptions from the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation around 4,200 years ago, describe a world falling apart. One account laments, "The river is dry and men cross the water on foot. The land is dimmed, the sun is hidden, the land is ruined, nothing remains." This is not poetic metaphor, it is the stark report of a civilization experiencing a systemic collapse, a prolonged era of low Niles that starved the Basin Irrigation system and emptied the state granaries. When the river delivered too much, the consequences were equally devastating. Imagine a flood not of 16, but of 18 or 20 cubits. At that level, the carefully engineered networks of dikes and basins were not just overwhelmed, they became part of the problem. The very walls built to contain the water would trap it in violent, chaotic lakes, preventing it from draining back into the main channel. Entire villages, built on tells thought to be safe, would be submerged. The archaeological site of the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, for instance, shows evidence of repeated, severe flooding that required the entire community to abruptly abandon their homes and relocate to higher ground, disrupting the sacred work of carving royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. A flood of this magnitude didn't just damage crops, it obliterated the agricultural infrastructure itself. It scoured away the fertile topsoil, filled canals with debris, and wiped out the boundary markers that defined field ownership, leading to years of legal disputes and social conflict long after the waters receded. The most profound consequence of these failures was inevitably famine. The intricate chain that connected the Nile to the dinner plate would snap. A low Nile meant no water for the basins, leading to a failed planting season. A destructively high Nile meant the seeds and young plants were washed away or rotted in waterlogged fields. In either scenario, the result was the same: the crucial harvest of emmer wheat and barley never happened. The state granaries, that magnificent buffer against hunger, had their limits. A single bad year could be weathered, but 2 or 3 consecutive years of flood failure would exhaust even the most prudent reserves. Tomb inscriptions and papyri from these crisis periods paint a harrowing picture. They speak of people desperate enough to eat leaves and grass, of families selling their children into servitude for a few loaves of bread, and of the unburied dead in the streets. A powerful nobleman named Ankh-Tifi, who lived during the First Intermediate Period, recorded his own actions in this time of crisis with a mix of pride and grim reality, stating, "I fed the hungry of the entire land. I never allowed anyone to die of hunger." While likely an exaggeration, this boast reveals that localized famine was a recognized and terrifying feature of a failed inundation. This breakdown of the food supply invariably led to a collapse of social order and a crisis of political legitimacy. The entire Egyptian state was founded on a sacred contract. The pharaoh, as the intermediary with the gods, was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that guaranteed the Nile's annual return. When the river failed, the pharaoh was seen to have failed. The corvée labor system, which depended on a well-fed, compliant population, would dissolve as people were forced to focus solely on scavenging for their own survival. Looting of granaries, attacks on officials, and widespread banditry became common. The sage Ipuwer, in a text describing the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, lamented, "The land spins like a potter's wheel. The poor have become rich, and the high-born are in mourning." This was a description of a world turned upside down, where the established hierarchy and the divine right of the king were being questioned in the face of empty bellies and a silent river. Such periods of unrest often culminated in the fall of dynasties and the fragmentation of the kingdom, as regional governors seized power, no longer believing the central authority in Memphis or Thebes could protect them. Yet, in a final testament to their resilience, the Egyptians did not see these disasters as final verdicts. Instead, they treated them as brutal but essential lessons. Each catastrophic failure became a catalyst for refinement and innovation in their survival strategies. A period of exceptionally high floods likely prompted engineers to redesign and strengthen the dike systems, perhaps making them broader or with a gentler slope to better dissipate the water's energy. They may have also expanded the network of overflow channels, creating deliberate spillways to divert excess water into designated flood zones, sacrificing some land to save the most vital agricultural heartland. Evidence from the Middle Kingdom, which arose after the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, shows a dramatic increase in state organization around water management. This was the era of massive, centralized public works, like the extensive canal building and land reclamation projects in the Fayum Oasis under Pharaoh Amenemhat III. It seems the collective trauma of famine and collapse had taught a powerful lesson. Survival required an even more robust, more centralized, and more ambitious approach to controlling the environment. Similarly, prolonged drought would have forced a reckoning with the granary system. The bureaucracy may have implemented stricter protocols for stockpiling, mandating that a larger percentage of each harvest be stored, or creating a more sophisticated system of regional granaries to better distribute relief during a crisis. The very psychological and spiritual trauma of a failing Nile also refined their religious response. The fervor of the rituals to Hapi and Sobek would have intensified, and new prayers, new hymns, and new offerings would have been developed in a desperate attempt to regain the favor of the gods. The myth of Osiris, with its themes of death and rebirth, would have taken on a deeper, more personal meaning, providing a framework for understanding their suffering and a narrative of hope for the river's eventual return. These catastrophic failures were not the end of their story. They were the painful but necessary pressure that forged a more resilient, more adaptable, and ultimately more enduring civilization, one that learned to read the river's wrath as clearly as it read its generosity. But perhaps the most breathtaking example of their ambition, a project that truly encapsulates the scale of Egyptian hydrological thinking, lies not in the main Nile Valley itself, but in a vast desert depression to the west, the Fayum Oasis. This was not a passive landscape blessed by the river. It was a landscape radically and deliberately transformed by human will into the greatest public works project of the Middle Kingdom. To understand the Fayum is to understand the Egyptians thinking like ecosystem architects, manipulating geography itself for a singular, powerful purpose, to build a massive national safety valve for the unpredictable Nile. The key to this transformation was a single monumental canal, the Bahr Yusuf, or River of Joseph. Though its name comes from a later Arabic legend, its origins are purely pharaonic, a testament to the vision of rulers like Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty. The concept was audacious. The Nile, just north of the city of Beni Suef, naturally branches into a smaller, seasonal watercourse. The Egyptians saw an opportunity in this. They undertook the Herculean task of digging, widening, and deepening this channel, turning it into a permanent, engineered canal that stretched for over 300 kilometers, deliberately diverting a steady, controlled portion of the Nile's flow westward, directly into the vast, arid bowl of the Fayum Depression. This was not a simple irrigation ditch. This was strategic water diversion on a colossal scale. The goal was not just to water a few new fields, it was to fill the depression and create a gigantic, artificial reservoir now known to the Greeks as Lake Moeris. In its managed heyday, this lake was a staggering expanse of water, covering over 1,000 square miles. Think of it as the ancient world's largest and most sophisticated battery, but instead of storing electricity, it stored the one commodity that meant life itself, water. During the peak of the annual inundation, when the Nile was at its most powerful and potentially destructive, the Bahr Yusuf Canal would act as a pressure release valve. It would siphon off a significant volume of the floodwaters, channeling this excess away from the vulnerable floodplain in the north and safely into the vast, waiting basin of the Fayum. This single action mitigated the risk of catastrophic flooding downstream, protecting towns, fields, and infrastructure. Then, when the inundation season ended and the main river began to shrink during the dry months, the process could be reversed. The water held in the immense reservoir of Lake Moeris could be gradually released back into the canal system, flowing back to replenish the Nile in the valley and providing a crucial, reliable water source for irrigation long after the natural flood had passed. The secondary effect of this mega engineering project was to transform the Fayum region itself from a marginal desert area into the most productive breadbasket in all of Egypt. The constant, regulated flow of water through the Bahr Yusuf and the stable presence of the massive lake created a perfectly controlled environment for agriculture. An intricate network of smaller canals branched off from the main channel, distributing water with precision to vast, newly reclaimed fields. The climate around the lake became more temperate, and the moisture supported lush vegetation. This newly fertile land was not subject to the same dramatic boom and bust cycle as the main valley. While farmers elsewhere held their breath waiting for the inundation, the Fayum, with its managed water supply, offered predictable, year-round cultivation. It became a land of immense orchards, of vineyards, and of incredibly rich grain fields, producing a massive agricultural surplus that directly supplied the royal court and helped fund the state's ambitions. The Fayum was more than an oasis, it was a testament to the power of central planning, a man-made paradise that demonstrated the ultimate goal of Egyptian flood strategy, not just to react to the river's moods, but to re-engineer the entire hydrological system of a region to create guaranteed, resilient abundance for centuries to come. What's truly remarkable about this Egyptian mastery of the river is that its brilliance wasn't lost when their own dynasties faded into history. Their hydraulic wisdom proved so effective, so perfectly adapted to the unique rhythm of the Nile, that it became the unshakable standard for every single power that subsequently ruled this land. For centuries after the last native pharaoh, the very survival of Egypt depended on foreign conquerors recognizing one simple truth: you do not reinvent the wheel when it comes to taming this river. When the mighty Persian Empire under Darius I marched in during the 5th century before the Common Era, they were initially viewed as harsh overlords. Yet, even they quickly grasped that their control over this fertile prize was entirely dependent on maintaining the agricultural system they had inherited. The Persians were master administrators of a vast, multicultural empire, and they saw the Egyptian basin network not as a relic to be discarded, but as a pre-existing, high-functioning economic engine. Instead of dismantling it, they invested in it. Historical records and inscriptions tell us that Darius actually completed a canal project that a pharaoh had begun over a century earlier, a waterway intended to more efficiently link the Nile to the Red Sea, facilitating trade. This wasn't just about commerce, it was about demonstrating a commitment to the land's prosperity. The Persian satraps, or governors, understood that their legitimacy and their ability to extract grain and wealth from Egypt hinged on keeping the basins full and the peasants productive. They adopted the existing bureaucratic framework, employing local Egyptian scribes and surveyors who knew the system intimately. By choosing to maintain and even expand upon the pharaonic hydraulic model, the Persians ensured a steady flow of Egyptian grain back to their imperial heartland, proving that pragmatic empire building meant preserving the very systems that made Egypt worth conquering in the first place. This pattern of adoption reached its most sophisticated form under the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, the successors of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies didn't just maintain the Egyptian system, they became its most ambitious and systematizing stewards. Establishing their capital at the new, glittering port of Alexandria, They viewed Egypt not as a sacred homeland, but as a vast, private estate to be managed for maximum profit. To them, the annual inundation and the Basin Irrigation network were the ultimate cash flow. They transformed the ancient, state-controlled agricultural model into a hyper-efficient, centralized machine. Under the Ptolemies, the role of the ancient vizier was essentially absorbed by a powerful minister known as the dioikites, the chief financial minister of the kingdom. This official, often a Greek, presided over an expanded bureaucracy that meticulously documented every aspect of land and water use. They introduced even more rigorous land surveys and tax assessments, tying revenue directly to the flood levels recorded by the Nilometers, just as the pharaohs had done. But the Ptolemies also pushed the system to its absolute limits. They launched massive land reclamation projects, particularly in the Fayum, which they renamed the Lake of Moeris and transformed into a royal agricultural reserve. They settled their Greek veteran soldiers there, parceling out plots of land with the condition that they would cultivate them using the established Egyptian methods, thus grafting a new ruling class directly onto the old agricultural backbone. The Ptolemies' genius lay in their fusion of Greek administrative precision with millennia of Egyptian hydrological experience. They recognized that the native Egyptian farmers and engineers possessed an irreplaceable, granular knowledge of the land, which fields flooded first, how long to let water stand in a specific basin, how to repair a particular dike. By harnessing this local expertise and directing it with their top-down economic goals, they turned Egypt into the wealthiest and most stable of the Hellenistic kingdoms, its granaries feeding the entire eastern Mediterranean and funding the construction of the legendary Library of Alexandria. Their entire kingdom, in essence, was built on the foundational principle laid down thousands of years earlier: control the water, and you control everything. When the eagles of Rome eventually eclipsed the power of the Ptolemies, the transition was, hydraulically speaking, seamless. The Romans, the supreme engineers of the ancient world, famous for their aqueducts and sewers, arrived in Egypt and looked upon the Nile Valley with a sense of profound respect. They saw a system that was, in many ways, more complex and more perfectly integrated with its environment than anything they had built. Here was a civilization that had successfully managed a single river for 3,000 years. The Roman response was not to impose a new Roman model of water management, but to integrate the Egyptian system into their own imperial machine, treating the Nile Valley as the breadbasket of the Roman world. Roman Egypt became the personal possession of the emperor, administered by a prefect of equestrian rank, and its primary export, grain, was directed straight to the city of Rome itself to feed its restless million-strong population. The famous Roman organizational genius was applied not to reinventing the basin irrigation system, but to optimizing its logistics and maintenance on an unprecedented scale. They continued the Ptolemaic practice of detailed land surveys, and inscriptions from the Roman period show them diligently repairing canals and dikes, often boasting of restoring them to a state better than before. The Roman administration understood that any neglect of this infrastructure would lead to famine not in some distant province, but in the very heart of their empire, at the Roman Forum. They maintained the Nilometer stations with religious devotion, and the data collected continued to dictate tax rates and agricultural planning across the province. The Romans were so confident in the enduring effectiveness of the Egyptian model that they exported its core principles to other parts of their empire with similar riverine environments. Elements of basin irrigation and centralized water management can be seen in Roman North Africa and even in parts of Europe, a clear testament to the universal logic they recognized in the pharaonic approach. For Rome, Egypt was the ultimate prize precisely because its ancient survival strategies had been perfected over millennia, creating a reliable, predictable source of wealth and power that required maintenance not innovation. To truly appreciate the unique genius of the Egyptian approach, we need to step outside the Nile Valley and look eastward to the land between two other great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the heartland of ancient Mesopotamia. While both of these cradles of civilization were riverine societies dependent on seasonal floods for their survival, the nature of the rivers themselves and the human responses they demanded created two profoundly different worlds. The fundamental distinction lies in the character of the floods. Egypt's Nile was a model of relative predictability. Its annual inundation was primarily fed by the regular, seasonal monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, a pattern that created a slow, steady, and generally reliable rise in the river. The gentle northward flow and the protected, narrow valley allowed the Egyptians to anticipate and manage the flood with a remarkable degree of precision. The Mesopotamian experience, by stark contrast, was one of pure, terrifying volatility. The Tigris and Euphrates were fed by snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia, and their floods were not only sudden and violent, but also catastrophically unpredictable in their timing. They could arrive as early as April or as late as June, at the worst possible moment for the standing grain crops, completely out of sync with the agricultural calendar. A Mesopotamian farmer could not plan with the same serene confidence as his Egyptian counterpart. He lived under the constant threat of a raging torrent that could arrive without warning and wash away an entire year's labor in a single furious day. This environmental reality forced Mesopotamian civilization to develop a survival strategy that was fundamentally more defensive and reactionary. Their irrigation systems were marvels of engineering in their own right, vast networks of canals that were absolutely necessary to channel water from the rivers to the thirsty fields of the arid plains. However, the primary purpose of these systems was often damage control. The violent, silt-laden waters of the Tigris, in particular, had a devastating tendency to clog their carefully dug canals with sediment. This required a constant, exhausting battle of dredging and maintenance simply to keep the system functioning at all. Unlike the Egyptian basin system, which was designed to gently spread and retain the flood's life-giving water and silt, Mesopotamian irrigation was a constant fight to control a destructive force, to tame the river just enough to siphon off the water needed for survival. This created a precarious existence. A breached canal could become a raging torrent, flooding fields and settlements, while a silted-up canal could lead to drought and salt accumulation in the soil. This ever-present danger of either too much or too little water, with far less predictability, meant that Mesopotamian society was built on a foundation of constant, high-stakes environmental stress. The margin for error was razor-thin, and a single miscalculation or a period of neglect could lead to widespread crop failure and the collapse of entire city-states. The nature of the rivers also had a direct and powerful impact on the political structures that emerged in each civilization. In Egypt, the Nile served as a unifying superhighway, a central artery that ran the entire length of the country, binding the distant provinces of Upper and Lower Egypt together. Travel and communication by boat were efficient and relatively safe, allowing the central authority of the pharaoh in Memphis or Thebes to project its power effectively. This geographical cohesion naturally fostered the development of a strong, centralized, and remarkably stable state that endured for millennia with its core institutions largely intact. The pharaoh was the unchallenged god-king, the ultimate manager of the Nile, and his ability to coordinate the national response to the flood was the very source of his legitimacy and power. Mesopotamia, with its two separate, unpredictable rivers and a more open, exposed geography, developed along a completely different political trajectory. The region was a fractured landscape of independent and often fiercely competitive city-states like Ur, Uruk, and Babylon, Each city had to build and maintain its own complex irrigation network, leading to a natural decentralization of power. Cooperation was difficult, and conflicts over water rights and land were common. This environment bred a political culture that was far more volatile, marked by frequent warfare, shifting alliances, and the rise and fall of successive empires: the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. While powerful rulers emerged, they were typically warlords and administrators who had to constantly fight to maintain control over a collection of distinct and often rebellious territories, rather than the divinely ordained stewards of a single, unified national ecosystem. This divergent path is perhaps most clearly reflected in the stark contrast between the long-term stability of ancient Egypt and the turbulent, cyclical history of Mesopotamia. Egyptian civilization, with its predictable river and centralized management, demonstrated an astonishing continuity. Its cultural, religious, and political institutions remained recognizable for nearly 3,000 years. The office of the pharaoh, the pantheon of gods, the practice of mummification, and the artistic styles all persisted with a consistency that is unmatched in the ancient world. This longevity was a direct product of a system that worked, a system that effectively buffered society against the worst shocks of the natural world. Mesopotamia, for all its brilliant innovations in writing, law, and astronomy, experienced a much more fragmented and tumultuous history. Its city-states and empires rose with dramatic speed and collapsed with equal ferocity, often due to a combination of internal strife, external invasion, and, critically, the failure of their delicate and demanding irrigation systems. A period of weak central authority could lead to the neglect of the vital canal networks, resulting in salinization of the soil, a crippling problem far less common in the Nile Valley, or destructive flooding that shattered the agricultural base. The very unpredictability of the Tigris and Euphrates seemed to be mirrored in the region's political destiny, a relentless cycle of creation and destruction. This comparison is not about declaring one civilization superior to the other, but about understanding how the unique challenges of their environments shaped their societies in profound and lasting ways. The Egyptians, blessed with a more predictable partner in the Nile, built a civilization focused on eternal order and stability. The Mesopotamians, facing the chaotic fury of their rivers, became masters of adaptation and resilience, building and rebuilding their magnificent, yet inherently fragile, world in the face of constant uncertainty. For 3,000 years, the brilliant, adaptive dance between the ancient Egyptians and their river remained largely unchanged. The rhythm of inundation, basin irrigation, and renewal was the unchanging heartbeat of the land. But in the 20th century, humanity's relationship with nature underwent a fundamental shift, and on the banks of the Nile, this shift became concrete and steel. The age-old dream of finally, completely taming the river culminated in one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the modern era, the Aswan High Dam. This colossal structure, completed in 1970, was a declaration of a new kind of power. It represented the ultimate triumph of the very philosophy the ancient Egyptians had so wisely avoided, the philosophy of total control. Where the pharaohs sought to guide and cooperate with the Nile's natural cycle, the modern dam sought to replace it entirely, to subdue the river's ancient pulse with the hum of turbines and the silent, massive weight of a reservoir named for the president who championed it, Lake Nasser. The immediate benefits were so profound they seemed to herald a new golden age. For the first time in recorded history, the existential fear of a bad Nile was effectively erased. The dam's vast reservoir could store years' worth of floodwater, guaranteeing a reliable, predictable supply for agriculture regardless of the rainfall in distant highlands. It ended the cycle of drought and famine that had plagued Egypt for millennia, securing the food supply for a rapidly growing population. Furthermore, the dam's hydroelectric turbines promised to catapult Egypt into the industrial age. The massive output of the Aswan High Dam electrified entire regions, powering new factories, bringing light to remote villages, and becoming a potent symbol of national pride and modernization. It seemed like the ultimate fulfillment of the ancient quest for mastery over the Nile, a technological marvel that had solved the age-old problem once and for all. Yet this victory came with a staggering, and in many ways unforeseen, price tag. In stopping the annual flood, the dam also halted the very process that had built and sustained Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia, the deposit of the rich black silt. That precious cargo, carried over 1,500 kilometers from the Ethiopian highlands, now settles at the bottom of Lake Nasser, trapped behind the dam wall. The implications of this are catastrophic for the long-term health of the land. For centuries, this free, natural fertilizer renewed the soil's nutrients, eliminating the need for chemical alternatives. Today, Egyptian farmers are forced to rely heavily on manufactured fertilizers, which are expensive, produce harmful agricultural runoff, and degrade the soil structure over time. The land, once annually rejuvenated by nature's own hand, is now slowly being mined of its vitality. The consequences ripple outward in a cascade of environmental disruption. Without the annual pulse of silt to replenish the Nile Delta, Egypt's Mediterranean coastline is now in a state of rapid erosion. The delta is quite literally washing away into the sea. For centuries, the river's sediment load acted as a natural counterweight to the Mediterranean's waves, constantly building and reinforcing the shoreline. Now, with that supply cut off, the sea is reclaiming the land, threatening coastal cities, farmland, and fragile ecosystems. Compounding this crisis is a phenomenon called saltwater intrusion. The Nile's powerful freshwater flow used to act as a hydraulic barrier, pushing back against the encroaching saltwater from the Mediterranean. With the river's flow now so carefully regulated and reduced, salty seawater is seeping inland, contaminating the freshwater aquifers and rendering the soil in the delta increasingly saline and less fertile. This silent, creeping crisis threatens the very breadbasket of modern Egypt. The human cost was equally immense. The creation of the vast Lake Nasser reservoir required the flooding of hundreds of miles of the Nile Valley in Lower Nubia, a region with a rich cultural history spanning thousands of years. This led to the forced displacement of over 100,000 people, the Nubians, from their ancestral homelands. Entire villages, historic mosques, and ancient archaeological sites were lost forever beneath the rising waters. While an unprecedented international rescue effort, led by UNESCO, managed to save the great temples of Abu Simbel and Falah by physically relocating them block by block to higher ground, countless lesser-known sites and the living cultural fabric of Nubia were sacrificed. The dam, built to secure the future of one people, irrevocably shattered the past of another. This story serves as a profound and humbling lesson. The ancient Egyptians thrived for so long because they worked within the river's natural system, using its energy and accepting its gifts. The Aswan High Dam represents the modern impulse to dominate and redesign that system. While it solved the immediate, terrifying problem of famine, it created a new, more complex, and slower-moving set of crises that continue to challenge Egypt today. The management of the Nile remains a delicate balancing act, a testament to the fact that even with all our technology, we are still learning the timeless lesson the river teaches, that true resilience lies not in domination, but in a respectful and deeply insightful understanding of the natural world. So what can we, living in an age of satellites and supercomputers, truly learn from a civilization that measured its wealth in baskets of grain? The answer lies not in their specific tools, but in their overarching philosophy: a profound set of principles that feel startlingly urgent today. The first and perhaps most powerful lesson is their commitment to long-term thinking. The Egyptians were not planning for the next quarter or even the next election cycle. They were planning for the next century, the next millennium. The construction of a Nilometer wasn't a one-year project. It was an investment in a data collection system that would benefit generations unborn. The planting of a sycamore tree, whose shade would not be enjoyed by the person who planted it, was a common act of foresight. This intergenerational perspective was baked into their culture, a stark contrast to our often myopic focus on immediate returns. They understood that true security against a slow-moving, recurring threat like the Nile's variability couldn't be achieved with quick fixes. It required patient, sustained investment in infrastructure, the canals, the dikes, the granaries, that would pay dividends for 1,000 years. In our own era of climate change, another slow-moving crisis defined by rising seas and intensifying weather patterns, their example is a powerful rebuke. We are grappling with the consequences of short-term decision-making, while they demonstrated that surviving a volatile environment demands a vision that spans lifetimes. This brings us to their second and most elegant principle, working with nature, not against it. The Egyptians never sought to defeat the Nile. They didn't try to stop the flood. Instead, they sought to understand its rhythm and then choreograph a dance around it. They saw the inundation not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as a powerful partner to be guided. The Basin Irrigation system is the perfect symbol of this. They didn't build a wall to hold the water back. They built gentle, earthen embankments to invite the water in, to convince it to linger and settle. They used the natural topography of the land, creating a system that amplified nature's own processes rather than replacing them. They were masters of what we might now call soft engineering or nature-based solutions. They leveraged the river's own energy to transport silt, used the sun's heat to bake their bricks, and understood that the land itself could act as a sponge. Compare this to our modern instinct, so perfectly captured by the Aswan High Dam, which is to dominate and control nature with brute force. The dam solved one set of problems, but created a host of others: the loss of fertile silt, coastal erosion, and salinization, precisely because it broke the natural cycle the Egyptians had so wisely learned to nurture. Their success whispers a crucial question to us today. As we face rising sea levels, should we only build higher seawalls, or can we also learn to restore wetlands and mangrove forests that absorb the ocean's energy, working with these natural systems to protect our coastlines? A third critical lesson is the undeniable power of centralized coordination for tackling large-scale, existential threats. The management of the Nile was far beyond the capacity of any single village or regional governor. It required a society-wide effort orchestrated by a strong, central authority, the pharaoh's administration, the vizier dispatching surveyors to maintain canals and organizing the corvée labor, was essentially the CEO of a national water and food security corporation. This centralized system allowed for the standardization of measures, the fair distribution of water, the maintenance of a national grain reserve, and the execution of massive projects like the development of the Fayum. When a low Nile was predicted, the state could activate a pre-planned response, moving food from regions of surplus to areas of scarcity. This wasn't a top-down tyranny for its own sake, it was a practical necessity for survival. In our globally connected world, we face challenges that are similarly vast and borderless: pandemics, climate change, plastic pollution in the oceans. The Egyptian model suggests that effective solutions require a level of international coordination and data sharing that mirrors their national effort. Just as the Nilometer's data was vital for the whole kingdom, our global climate data needs to be shared and acted upon with a unified purpose. Their experience argues that some problems are simply too big for fragmented, piecemeal responses. Ultimately, all of these principles converged into a single, magnificent outcome: the creation of a deeply resilient system. Resilience is not the absence of shock, it is the capacity to absorb shock and recover quickly. The ancient Egyptians didn't prevent bad Niles from happening, they built a society that could withstand them. The granary network was their buffer against famine. The Basin Irrigation system was their buffer against drought. The corvée labor system was their buffer against infrastructure decay. Each layer of their strategy provided a backup, a redundancy that ensured a single point of failure wouldn't lead to total collapse. This is perhaps the most vital takeaway for our modern world, where climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. We, too, need to build resilience into our systems. This means diversifying our energy grids, strengthening our local food systems, and designing our cities to be more flexible and adaptive. The Egyptians teach us that resilience isn't about predicting the future perfectly, it's about building a society that is robust enough to handle an unpredictable future. Their civilization endured for 3,000 years not because they were lucky, but because they were prepared. They looked at the mighty, unpredictable Nile and saw a teacher. They learned its lessons of patience, partnership, and preparedness, ancient wisdom that now flows down to us, offering a timeless guide for navigating the rising tides of our own time. And so, we reach the end of our journey along the ancient, life-giving Nile. We've witnessed a civilization facing down an annual cataclysm and transforming it into the very source of its power. From the humble, rhythmic dip of the Shaduf lifting water to the parched fields, to the monumental ambition of reshaping the entire Fayum oasis into a giant hydrological battery, the Egyptians demonstrated a spectrum of ingenuity that is nothing short of breathtaking. We saw the quiet genius of the farmer with his scratch plow and the administrative mastery of the vizier coordinating a national response. We marveled at the elegant predictability of the calendar, guided by the star Sirius, and the cold, hard data collected from the stone steps of the Nilometer. We explored the physical landscape, crisscrossed with canals and dikes that formed the Basin Irrigation system, a managed ecosystem that turned the entire floodplain into a fertile sponge. And we understood the social architecture, from the corvée labor that harnessed the flood season's idle hands to the state granaries that served as a national insurance policy against famine. Even their spiritual world was enlisted in this grand project, with rituals for happy and reverence for Sobek providing a psychological and divine framework for understanding the river's dual nature. This was not a piecemeal effort, it was a deeply integrated, society-wide defense system where engineering, astronomy, bureaucracy, and religion were all threads woven into a single, unbreakable rope of survival. Ultimately, the story of ancient Egypt's relationship with the Nile is a powerful testament to the fact that their millennia of success were not a gift of luck or a simple accident of geography. It was the direct result of brilliant, sustained human effort. It was born from generations of meticulous observation, where priests tracked stars and scribes recorded cubits of water height until they could discern patterns in the seemingly chaotic. It was fueled by engineering innovation, from the simple lever of the Shaduf to the colossal earthworks of the canal networks, each invention designed to nudge the river's power in their favor. Most importantly, it was cemented by unparalleled social organization, the ability of a central authority to coordinate the labor and resources of millions, to think in terms of centuries, and to build institutions like the granaries and the corvée system that created a resilient buffer against the inevitable bad years. They looked upon a force of nature that could have wiped them out and responded not with fear, but with foresight. They chose to dance with the river, to learn its rhythm, and in doing so, they built one of the most stable and enduring civilizations the world has ever known. Their legacy is a masterclass in turning existential threats into enduring strengths. Now, we turn this incredible story over to you. After this deep dive into the world of ancient Egyptian survival, we're curious which of their strategies do you find the most impressive or ingenious? Was it the elegant simplicity of the shaduf, a tool that extended the reach of the river itself, or perhaps the sheer scale of the Basin Irrigation system, a feat of landscape engineering that fed a nation? Maybe it was the foresight behind the granary network, an ancient welfare system that stored abundance for lean years, or could it be the spiritual sophistication of their beliefs, where the myth of Osiris gave profound meaning to the annual cycle of death and rebirth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing what captures your imagination. If you enjoyed unraveling this ancient mystery with us, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We have many more deep dives into the secrets of the ancient world on the way, and we'd be thrilled to have you join us for the next adventure. Thank you for watching.